They found him hanging before the birds began to sing. The rope creaked softly against the oak branch, not with the violence of a struggle, but with the patience of something that had waited all night to be seen. His boots were clean, his coat was buttoned, his hat placed carefully on the ground beneath him, brim up like an offering, and his face was calm, not peaceful, prepared. This was Hollis Crane, overseer of the Bellamy Cotton Tract, found dead on the morning of May 11th, 1837, less than 50 yards from the slave quarters. He ruled with scripture in one hand and a ledger in the other. The plantation owners would later insist it was suicide. The church would record it as a private moral failing. The county would seal the inquest within 3 days. But the enslaved men and women, who were not asked, not recorded, not believed, whispered something else. They said Hollis Crane had been answered because the night before his death, one enslaved man had asked him a question. A single question, a question that no one was ever supposed to ask. And after that question was spoken, Hollis Crane was never seen alive again. The man who asked the question was known as Eli, though that was not the name his mother gave him. Eli worked in the southern fields, quiet, observant, known for remembering things others learned to forget in order to survive. He could recite entire sermons after hearing them once. He noticed symbols carved into fence posts. He noticed when prayers changed. On the evening of May 10th, Hollis Crane conducted what he called the reading. Every week, the overseer gathered select enslaved workers and read aloud from a small leather-bound book that was not a Bible, though it was treated like one. Passages about obedience, silence, the divine order of suffering. That night, the lantern light flickered strangely. Witnesses would later say the insects stopped hitting the glass, and when Hollis Crane finished reading, Eli raised his head. He did not stand. He did not resist. He simply asked, "Sir, if God marks every soul before birth, why do the names in your book change?" The clearing went still. Crane stared at Eli, not with anger, but with something closer to fear, because Eli was right. That ledger, never meant to be read aloud, contained names that shifted, crossed out, rewritten, sometimes replaced entirely. Hollis Crane closed the book. He told everyone to return to their quarters, and before he left, he leaned down and whispered something only Eli heard. "You shouldn't have seen the margins." That was the last thing Hollis Crane ever said to another living person. When Crane's body was discovered, the book was missing, not burned, not stolen, removed. Plantation records from that year list a gap. 3 full days of activity, unaccounted for. No cotton tallies, no punishment logs, no deaths, no births. But something else appears in the church archives weeks later. A quiet request from the Bellamy family, asking for additional grave plots. Despite no recorded losses, the enslaved community noticed something worse. Names stopped being spoken. People who had worked the fields for years were suddenly absent. No sale records, no escape notices, no graves, just erased. And when Eli was asked what he had seen in the book, he said only this: it wasn't counting bodies, it was counting obedience. The margins, he claimed, contained symbols older than scripture, marks used by early American revival sects who believed salvation could be transferred, suffering could be harvested, and certain people, chosen people, could be unwritten. 3 nights after Crane's death, Eli vanished. No chains, no blood, no witnesses. Only a single line scratched into the doorframe of his cabin. The question remains. The local church held Hollis Crane's funeral at dawn. No hymns, no eulogy, no mention of how he died. The pastor's sermon was brief and trembling. He spoke of burdens too heavy for mortal stewardship and warned the congregation against curiosity disguised as righteousness. Then the ledger appeared, returned clean, its margins scraped smooth. Within a year, the Bellamy Cotton Tract expanded. Within 5 years, the church added a locked annex. Within 10 years, Children from nearby towns began disappearing into its care. Orphans, wards, the unwanted, and always beneath the floorboards of that annex. Workers later claimed to hear a sound like pages turning slowly, patiently, as if something was still counting. This was not the end of Hollis Crane. This was the beginning of a system that learned how to erase people without killing them. By 1846, the church beside the Bellamy lands was no longer just a place of worship. It had become a destination. Children arrived in wagons without parents, without documents, without questions. Some were left at the gate. Others were transferred from nearby counties after fires, floods, or unexplained family disappearances. The records called them orphans, but the intake logs were strange. Names were written in pencil. Ages were estimates. Birthplace often left blank. And beside many entries, a symbol appeared. Not a cross, not a letter, but a curved mark, like a hook closing in on itself. The caretakers called it the sign of correction. The children called it the quiet mark, because once it was written beside your name, you were expected to stop asking questions. Education at the annex orphanage followed no known curriculum. Children learned hymns that were never sung during Sunday service. They memorized passages that were not found in any Bible, and every evening just before sleep, they were required to stand in silence while a caretaker read from a book kept chained to the lectern. Former residents, those who survived long enough to leave, would later describe the sensation the same way. It felt like the room was listening back. The book was not read aloud for meaning. It was read for rhythm. Names were spoken slowly. Pauses were deliberate. Sometimes the caretaker would stop mid-name, as if waiting for something unseen to respond. Children who cried during these readings were removed. Children who asked what the book was for were removed. Children who noticed the margins were removed. Their beds were empty by morning. No one was allowed to say their names again. Beneath the annex was a room not listed on any blueprint. Caretakers referred to it only as below. Children knew it by another name. They called it the listening floor. The steps leading down were uneven, carved directly into stone. The walls were covered in chalk marks that were regularly washed away and redrawn. At the center of the room stood a wide table, scarred, stained, its surface etched with overlapping symbols, and beneath that table, the sound a low, steady creaking. Not wood, not rope, something heavier, as if something vast were slowly shifting its weight beneath the building. Caretakers insisted. The noise was only the foundation settling, but children who were taken below returned different, quieter, slower, their eyes unfocused. Some could no longer remember their own names. Others remembered too much. In 1852, a girl named Clara Wynne did something no child had done before. She spoke one of the margin symbols out loud. No one knows how she learned its sound. The symbol was never taught, never explained. But during the evening reading, as the caretaker paused between names, Clara whispered the sound. Witnesses said the lanterns dimmed instantly. The caretaker dropped the book, and from below the floorboards came a sound like a deep exhale. Clara was taken that night, but she did not disappear. Instead, her name was rewritten. The symbol beside it was erased, and in its place was written a word that appeared nowhere else in the records. Accounted over the next decades, the orphanage expanded. So did the pattern. Children marked early often vanished quickly. Children who survived long enough to learn silence were kept. And every few years when the book's margins grew crowded, a caretaker would be found dead, always alone, always calm, always hanging. Their deaths were recorded as despair. But the book remained because the system did not require belief, only participation. By the time the Civil War approached, the annex had perfected something far worse than erasure. It had learned how to prepare people to be removed without resistance. By 1871, the annex orphanage had produced something new. Not survivors, not believers, but candidates. Young men, quiet, disciplined, emotionally hollow, were transferred north, under the authority of the church, to a newly established theological seminary. Officially, it was a place of correction and moral education. Unofficially, it was where the system taught its most important lesson: how to forget without losing function. The seminary stood on a hill of white stone, its windows narrow, its doors heavy. Every student who entered signed a covenant pledging obedience not to doctrine, but to process. And the first thing taken from them was not their name. It was their memory of asking why. Section 11. The curriculum of absence. Classes at the seminary were structured around subtraction. Students studied sermons with missing verses. They memorized hymns stripped of melody. They practiced confession without absolution. One instructor wrote in his private notes, "We do not teach faith. We teach containment." The ledger arrived at the seminary in 1873, transported in a locked crate with no inventory record. When opened, witnesses said its pages felt warm. Its margins were once again full. Students were required to copy its contents daily, but only the center text. The margins were forbidden, except during night instruction. That was when the symbols were explained not as language, but as pressure points. Each symbol corresponded to a mental surrender, a hesitation removed, a resistance dulled. By graduation, most students could look directly at the ledger without reacting. A few could even hear it turn pages when it was closed. Graduates were never sent back to their towns. Instead, they were placed in institutions, prisons, hospitals, workhouses, remote parishes, anywhere control required quiet authority. Wherever they went, the same changes followed. Records thinned. Inmates stopped resisting. Patients forgot what they had been admitted for. And occasionally, always quietly, someone would disappear without trace, without paperwork, without grief. When questioned, the graduates responded identically. The account was balanced. No one knew what that meant. No one asked twice. In 1899, something went wrong. A student known only as Thomas R. in surviving documents did what no one had attempted in 60 years. During night instruction, he read the ledger backward. Witnesses described the air thickening as if the room were submerged. The instructor collapsed. The walls vibrated, not violently, but rhythmically. And from somewhere deep beneath the seminary, the sound returned, the same sound once heard beneath the orphanage. The sound of something being tallied. Thomas R. was found the next morning in the bell tower, hanging. His hands were clean, his shoes aligned, his face calm. In his pocket was a scrap of paper with a single sentence: "It does not want belief. It wants continuity." After that incident, the seminary was quietly shut down. No scandal, no investigation. The ledger was divided. Sections sent to different institutions, different states, different denominations. The system decentralized itself, which made it harder to see and impossible to stop. By 1912, reports emerged of orphanages, churches, and correctional facilities across the country sharing the same symbols, always in margins. Always unofficial, always denied. The question that began it all, the one Eli asked, was no longer remembered, but the answer had spread. The town of Merriwick does not appear on most modern maps. In 1918, it was a rail stop, a mill town, a place people passed through and rarely stayed. But Merriwick had something unusual: complete records, births, deaths, property transfers, church attendance. Nothing was missing, and that was how they noticed. A school teacher named Evelyn Price was the first to say it out loud. "There are names here that don't belong to anyone." In baptism logs, in court ledgers, in margin notes written by different hands, decades apart. Always the same symbols, always beside people. No one remembered meeting Merriwick's church, possessed one fragment of the ledger, inherited unknowingly through seminary transfers years earlier. When the town council finally confronted the pastor, He did not deny it. He only said, "It's older than us and it keeps things balanced." They decided to destroy it. The ledger fragment was taken to the church furnace and burned publicly. Witnesses said the fire went cold. The pages blackened but did not curl. The symbols remained visible in the ash. That night, the sound began from beneath the courthouse, from beneath the schoolhouse, from beneath the church ruins. A slow, patient turning. For 7 days after the burning, nothing happened. No deaths, no births, no accidents, but people began forgetting things. Not memories, connections. Parents forgot the emotional weight of their children. Spouses forgot why they had married. Grief vanished first, then joy. On the 8th day, the mill whistle blew and never stopped. When the townspeople reached it, they found the operator hanging, calm, prepared. In his pocket, a page of ash with one word, written clearly, unbalanced. In 1920, federal census workers arrived. Merwick reported a population of 0. The buildings were intact, furniture untouched, meals set out mid-preparation, but no people. In the courthouse basement, investigators later found thousands of names etched into the stone floor, layer upon layer, written until there was no space left. All of them marked, all of them accounted for. Merwick was declared abandoned due to economic collapse. The ledger fragment reappeared 2 years later in a state hospital archive, clean, restored, its margins empty again, ready. The system had adapted. It always did. The original question, the one Eli asked in 1837, was never answered. Not fully, but fragments remain in whispered traditions, redacted footnotes, and margins no one admits to reading. Because the truth is this: the system does not punish rebellion. It rewards silence. And as long as there are institutions that value order over truth, as long as there are ledgers that measure people instead of lives, the book will never close. It will only wait patiently for the next question. In 1939, a federal records clerk named Jonah Mercer was assigned to a sub-basement beneath a regional archive, an overflow space for materials deemed non-essential. There was no map of the room, only a key and a warning. Do not inventory the margins. Jonah was meticulous by nature. He catalogued everything. That was his mistake. Behind a false wall, he found boxes labeled only with dates. Inside them, fragments, not full ledgers. Never again, but pieces, torn margins, scraped symbols, ash-stained pages that felt strangely warm. What unsettled him most was consistency. Different states, different decades, same marks. The system had not died. It had gone quiet. Among the papers was a reel of microfilm, with no index card. Jonah played it. The images were baptism records, orphan intake lists, seminary rosters, but the center text blurred whenever he focused. Only the margins stayed sharp, and something else appeared between frames, names flashing too quickly to read, accompanied by a faint impression, as if the film itself were resisting observation. When Jonah slowed the reel, the projector jammed, the bulb shattered, and in the sudden darkness, he heard it, the sound, the same sound described across a century of testimony. Pages turning. Jonah Mercer's final journal entry was dated April 2nd, 1940. It read, "It doesn't record the past. It prevents the future from asking questions." The hanging men weren't punished. They were released. The next morning, Jonah was found in the archive stairwell, hanging, his shoes aligned, his hands clean, his face calm. In his pocket was not a note, but a margin fragment, blank, except for a single curved symbol, the symbol of correction. World War II buried everything. Records were lost, buildings destroyed, institutions dissolved. But the system did not require continuity of place, only function. Post-war hospitals adopted new intake methods. Schools emphasized compliance over curiosity. Churches simplified doctrine. And somewhere, always somewhere, Someone was keeping count of bodies of silence. Eli's question still exists. It was never written down in full, but historians believe it was not about God. It was about change. Why names could be rewritten. Why suffering could be reassigned. Why institutions remembered what people were taught to forget. And perhaps, most dangerous of all, who was doing the counting? The hangings were never executions. They were closures. When a caretaker learned too much, when a reader noticed the margins, when an overseer realized the ledger was not measuring others but using him, they were not killed. They were finished with. Today, margins still exist in digital forms, in redacted files. In footnotes, no one reads places where names disappear without explanation, where records resolve too neatly, where silence is treated as order. This is not a ghost story. There is no monster beneath the floor, no demon in the book, only a system old enough to understand one truth. If you control the questions, you never need to fear the answers. The event was not erased. It was normalized because remembering it would require asking what else was balanced without consent. What else was counted? What else was quietly removed? The last known fragment of the ledger was photographed in 1947, before vanishing into private hands. In its margin was a line written in a different script than all the others. Not a symbol, a sentence. When the questions return, so will